When Jesus had crossed over again by boat to the other side, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the sea. One of the synagogue leaders, named Jairus, came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet and begged him earnestly, "My little daughter is dying. Come and lay your hands on her so that she can get well and live." So Jesus went with him, and a large crowd was following and pressing against him. Now a woman suffering from bleeding for 12 years had endured much under many doctors. She had spent everything she had and was not helped at all. On the contrary, she became worse. Having heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his clothing. For she said, "If I just touch his clothes, I'll be made well." Instantly, her flow of blood ceased, and she sensed in her body that she was healed of her affliction. Immediately, Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" His disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing against you, and yet you say, 'Who touched me?'" But he was looking around to see who had done this. The woman, with fear and trembling, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. "Daughter," he said to her, "your faith has saved you. Go in peace and be healed from your affliction." While he was still speaking, people came from the synagogue leader's house and said, "Your daughter is dead. Why bother the teacher anymore?" When Jesus overheard what was said, he told the synagogue leader, "Don't be afraid. Only believe." He did not let anyone accompany him except Peter, James, and John, James' brother. They came to the leader's house and saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, "Why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but asleep." They laughed at him, but he put them all outside. He took the child's father, mother, and those who were with him, and entered the place where the child was. Then he took the child by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which is translated, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." Immediately the girl got up and began to walk. She was 12 years old. At this they were utterly astounded. Then he gave them strict orders that no one should know about this, and told them to give her something to eat. This is the Lord's word for us today. You may be seated.
Open up your Bibles with me to that passage, Mark chapter 5. It's on page 867 if you want to use one of the orange CSB Bibles that are around nearby you, hopefully. On page 867, we're in Mark chapter 5, beginning with verse 21. We're exploring through this Easter season. We're still in the season of Easter. We're exploring images of salvation in the New Testament. When followers of Jesus were making sense of what Jesus had accomplished through his death and resurrection, and then beginning to talk about it and beginning to teach about it and beginning to write about it, they use a whole host of images to describe what actually happened on Easter Sunday. What did God actually accomplish through the work of Jesus? And in doing so, they don't just give you like one sentence or one bullet point. Instead, they give you kind of a host of images, a host of metaphors that are designed to sort of hold up, and kind of like a diamond, you turn it around in your hand and you see light differently in different directions. That's sort of the power of the gospel that the New Testament writers invite us to consider. And they use a variety of images because the work that God accomplished and the work that he wants to do in your life is varied. There's a central theme to it, and then the application of that in your life can take a lot of different forms and a lot of different directions. And at various different times in your life and in your journey, you need aspects of the gospel that maybe you didn't know previously, or maybe you had forgotten. All of that is built into what it means to believe in who Jesus is. And so if you're here and someone maybe asked you at one point, "Are you saved?" and you weren't really sure what they were talking about, this is really an invitation for you to consider what that actually means to be saved. But even more than that, if you are someone who has been saved and it feels like a thing in the past or a thing that kind of was several years ago and you just kind of like moved on with your life, this is to invite you to consider that salvation is a way of life. It is a way of living that Jesus wants to invite you into. This morning, we're going to explore the image of salvation as healing. Salvation as healing. This might seem like a little bit of a foreign concept to many of us because the world that we live in tends to divide our spiritual lives and our physical lives. My physical life is over here. It's material, it's body, it's molecules, it's atoms. My spiritual life over here is disembodied. It's sort of disconnected. And so as long as I have a spiritual salvation, I'm good. The physical is kind of a secondary kind of thing. But the word for saved, the word most often used for saved in the New Testament, is the Greek word sozo, which is just a fun word to say. You can whip it out over lunch later. Sozo. It means saved, but within the meaning of that word is also to heal or to make whole. So when the New Testament is talking about being saved, and when first century followers of Jesus are reading the Gospels, or they're reading Paul or Peter in their writings about what Jesus accomplished for them, they would hear that you have been made whole. For example, that famous verse, by grace you have been saved through faith. What they would hear is, by grace you have been made whole through faith. You see, we tend to divide these things and say, Jesus is concerned about my spiritual life, but my physical life is kind of secondary. It's sort of in the way. And so I have a spiritual life, but my body and the things that are going on in my health, those things are secondary as long as my soul is right with God. Actually, Jesus wants wholeness for you. He wants healing for you. He wants to do a work in your life that's so much bigger than most of us imagine. And so this morning as we explore this image through this story, I want to just talk through three aspects of this. I want to first talk about why we need healing. Second, then I want to talk about how we are healed. And then third, then, how to experience that in your life. Or what is it like when you begin to experience the healing work of salvation in your life? So first, let's talk about why we need healing. Now, if you're over the age of like 4, this should be fairly obvious to you. If you're over the age of 40, this is very obvious to you. Right? We need healing. Our bodies break down. Our muscles atrophy. Our brains get foggy. Sickness is one of the few universals that all of us experience in human life. I don't want to remind you of this, but we went through one of the most significant global health crises just a few years ago. It was a universal kind of thing. We all experienced sickness. But for as universal as it is, we spend a whole lot of time, money, and energy trying to avoid it. In fact, the global wellness industry, I found out this week, is a $7 trillion a year industry. As a whole, humanity spends $7 trillion every year trying to be well. And the most surprising thing about that is most of the money that is spent in the wellness industry is not aging boomers, it's millennials and Gen Zers. You know, the young people around us are concerned about wellness. And so things like functional nutrition or beauty products or subscriptions to fitness services or your favorite YouTube fitness influencer or those weird glowing masks that you put on your face that are supposed to be really good for your skin but look terrifying. We want to be well. We want to be whole. And like health and wellness is not a bad thing. It's a good thing to be healthy. It's a good thing to take care of your body and your mind and your soul. It's probably a good thing to not eat a Whopper every single day. But beneath that, what that tells me is all of us have this sense that I want to be well. I want to be healthy. I want to be whole. And we are terrified of sickness and death. In our story today, we find, I think, two of the most pressing experiences of sickness that any of us could face in life. On the one hand, you have the acute sickness of a child. And on the other hand, you have the chronic sickness of an adult. These two, Mark, when he writes this story, he puts these two together and he weaves them in such a way that he wants you to see that these really are just two sides of the same condition, two sides of the same reality. You see, when a young child falls ill, there's an urgency to it. Right? It is unexpected. The community often rallies around, and there's vigils, and there's GoFundMes, and we feel that there's something wrong, that this has to be made right, and so you have a family that's advocating for the condition and the health of the child. There's an urgency. I need answers now. And so oftentimes our prayer in that moment is, God, would you heal? And if he doesn't, we say, why didn't you? On the other side of that is the chronic sickness that lingers in adults, where childhood has an urgency, adulthood sickness has an agony. The sense that, why am I not getting better? Why do I still have this condition? Why can't I find answers? You see this woman, her condition has driven her deeper into isolation. She has carried this sickness for 12 years, and her suffering has been silent and unseen. It's for many of you who carry chronic conditions, you know what that feels like. The day in, day out, why am I not getting better? And the prayer that we ask God, God, why don't you heal? Why aren't you coming through for me? See, both experiences are captured in this one story of Jesus healing. Both of them are equally difficult in the story, but Mark even gives us this kind of Easter egg of sorts where the girl has been sick for 12, or the girl is 12 years old and the woman has been sick for 12 years. He wants you to see that these are the same experience, that these stories are intertwined, and that the healing that they need and the salvation that they need is the same. And I think in this story, as we consider this, I think there's two important cautions that often get in the way for us when we think about Jesus healing me. On the one hand, it's the temptation to make physical healing everything. This is the approach of the woman to Jesus. She says, if I could just touch Jesus' robes, then I'll be healed. If I could just I don't want to bother him, but if I could just get a healing from him, that would be enough. You see, in this approach to Jesus, she's treating Jesus kind of like a magic object or like a talisman. Like if I could just touch him, if I could just get a healing, then that's all I need from him. And that would be enough. But Jesus' response to her shows us that for Jesus, just simply receiving a physical healing isn't enough for you. That's not actually the wholeness that he wants for you. Yes, that's great, but he wants more than that for you. See, for some of us, I think we have this approach to Jesus where we think if he doesn't heal, then somehow he's failed. Or that like Jesus is there, and maybe like you went through a really difficult diagnosis or really difficult sickness, and it seemed like he didn't answer your prayer in the way that you wanted to, he didn't come through in the way that you expected, or he hasn't answered that prayer yet. And so you begin to think, man, is Jesus really powerful? Is he really able to save? Is he really able to heal? And for some of you, it becomes a barrier to faith in general. That's because we're making physical healing everything. But what Jesus shows us in this story is what he wants to do in your life, what he wants to do in the life of everyone is wholeness. And sometimes he brings wholeness in the midst of our suffering, in the midst of our difficulty, in the midst of our struggle. And so Jesus isn't just about physical healing. He wants more for you. But the flip side temptation is to assume that Jesus cannot physically heal you, to kind of put him just in the realm of the spiritual and say, my body doesn't matter to him, or my suffering doesn't matter to him. This is somewhat the response of the little girl's family in the second half of the story. I mean, just consider this situation, right? Like, so we know the ending of the story, but what if we stopped halfway through, right? Just consider this little girl's family. They were urgent. They came to Jesus. They even got there first, and they somehow managed to get Jesus' attention from the crowd. That in itself is quite an accomplishment. And so Jesus has begun to direct his attention towards them, to move towards them. You got to imagine the hope that's now building in them. And all of a sudden, Jesus gets distracted by a woman over here. And while he's distracted over here, you get news that your daughter died. Man, what do you do in that situation? And so the response shows the limitations that they have placed on Jesus. They assume that because she's died, Jesus has no more power here. In fact, notice the resignation of the question, why bother the teacher anymore? Why bother him? He can't do anything here. See, some of us, especially depending on what stream of Christianity, if you grew up in Christianity, what stream of Christianity you grew up in, assume that healings happened in the Bible, but that time is over. And so the stories of healing in the Bible are nice, they're inspiring, they're encouraging, but the rest of us, we're just kind of supposed to grin and bear it until we get to the real healing, which is in heaven. But that's not what the New Testament teaches. In fact, consider James chapter 5. James chapter 5, the church is explicitly told to pray for healings. Is anyone among you sick? He should call for the elders of the church, and they are to pray over him, anointing him with oil in the name of the Lord. And the prayer of faith will save the sick person. Now, where I think we tend to get in trouble with this is we assume the way and the how and the when of that healing. We tend to assume, okay, that means I'm going to be healed in this way at this time in this circumstance. That's what they're doing here. They assume that Jesus couldn't heal because he wasn't at the bedside of the girl in the moment. And so they assume that there's only certain parameters in which Jesus would heal. But if you read the New Testament, particularly if you read the gospel accounts of Jesus healing, he almost never heals people in the exact same way. It's almost as if the variety of healing is as various as the people that he heals. Sometimes he heals through prayer. Sometimes he heals through touching. Sometimes he heals through spit. Sometimes he heals through words. Sometimes he heals silently. Sometimes he's in the room. Sometimes he's not. But the point is, Jesus can heal. And that power doesn't end just because he's not here. He can and does heal. And he can and does heal through prayer and through the power of the Holy Spirit at work in his people. And so what both of them get wrong, and I think what both of us tend to get wrong, is we assume that there's limitations on this. And both of them come to Jesus, and they have different kind of misunderstandings in opposite directions. And so in the center of this story, Mark gives us the interaction with the woman, because he wants us to see the way in which you and I are healed. How does this salvation that is healing come to us? And it is primarily through the body of Jesus. The means by which we are healed is through Jesus' body present in our world. You'll notice in the text that as this healing power goes out of Jesus, he notices it. He perceives that power is going out of him. It's only so often that you get kind of an inside look at the psychology of Jesus. But here Mark tells us that whenever healing happens, he knows that it's happening. Right? Which means that he's not just like a disembodied power source that just like, I'm going to get my charge from him and I'm going to go on my way. No, he is actively involved in the healing process. Now, this doesn't mean that he has like a limited amount of power resources, like he has to plug himself back in at night. It means that he is personally involved in each and every healing. He knows what is happening. He knows the needs. He knows that power, and his whole self, his whole body is connected to that healing. You see, there's no healing from Jesus without connection to Jesus. It is as you are connected to him and as he is connected to you that his healing power then flows into you. You can see it in the disciples' response to Jesus. They say, "Who touched me?" Right? Jesus is in a crowd. He says, "Who touched me?" And the disciples are like, "Everybody touched you. Everybody is all up in your business." No. For Jesus, it's a question of who came to connect with me. Who came to receive from me in faith. Who came to me in need. I want to know them. I want to be connected to them. You see, the healing power of Jesus comes to us through his body here in our world. He is not a spiritual disembodied power that is floating somewhere that you have to just sort of channel. No, his body is present in this world, and it is through his body in her world that is reachable, touchable, accessible, that heals her wounds. And it is that same body that heals our wounds. In fact, Peter later, he was likely in this scene. He's likely the one who asked Jesus who touched him. Later, he would teach the church this in 1 Peter chapter 2. He said, "He himself bore our sins in his body on the tree, so that having died to sins, we might live for righteousness. By his wounds, you have been healed." Because he was wounded, we can be healed. Because he was beaten, we can be restored. Because his body was given, we can be alive again. He's quoting here from Isaiah chapter 53, which was a promise that God gave his people in the Old Testament of how he would rescue and redeem them. And this is the full verse that Peter quotes here. It says this, "He himself bore our sicknesses, and he carried our pains. But we in turn regarded him stricken, struck down by God, and afflicted. But he was pierced because of our rebellion, crushed because of our iniquities. Punishment for our peace was on him, and we are healed by his wounds." You see, it is because Jesus has a real human body that suffers a real human death, that you and I can be healed. He takes on a body so that our bodies and our minds and our souls can be healed and reconciled to God. He carries our sicknesses and our pains. He is not immune to them. He's not detached from them. He knows them and he holds them for us. It is his body that bled for us. You see, the wholeness that Jesus came to accomplish, the salvation that he came to accomplish, is not just reserved for your spiritual life. It also has something to say about your physical life. He came to reconcile and restore, to bring together things that we have separated, to restore us in wholeness. And so when he enters into our world, taking on human flesh, he's saying, I'm not just about your soul, I'm about your wholeness. I'm about your anxiety. I'm about your stress. I'm about your disease. I'm about your sickness. I have something to say about all of those things. And I want to bring complete healness and wholeness to you. You see, this is really what sets Christianity apart from all other religions, all other spiritualities you can find. Almost every other major world religion is about escaping. I'm human. I need to get out of being human. I need to go be God. Only Christianity is about God becoming human. It's about coming into our world, humbling himself, taking on our flesh, and taking on our place. So we have a God who knows us and cares for us and has rescued us and redeemed us. Not us trying to get to him coming to us. And it's because he is here and because he has died for us that we can be saved. Like, isn't that good news? Isn't that good news, right? Like especially if you're in sickness, especially if you're struggling, especially if you're suffering, what's the last thing that you need? Try harder. What do I need? I need compassion. I need empathy. And what do we have in the God of the Bible who reveals himself in Jesus? A God who is with us. A God who has a body like us. A God who has suffered like us. A God who has died for us. That is how we are saved. It's a 4th century church father named Irenaeus who wrote this. He said, God recapitulated in himself the ancient formation of man, that he might kill sin, deprive death of its power, and vivify man. Another great word to use, vivify. Here's what he's saying. God became human in the person of Jesus. And in doing so, he kills sin. He takes it on and he defeats it. And by killing sin, he then defeats the power of death. And he then brings us to life again. That's what it means to vivify. Be vivified this morning. He has brought you to life again. He does all this by becoming human. This is why he would later say, Jesus became what we are so that we could become what he is. It is through his body that we are saved. And so if you want true healing this morning, if you want true restoration, you cannot come to Jesus only to get something from him. He is not an object to be manipulated. He is a person to be worshiped. He is a person to be followed, a person to be trusted. When we come to Jesus and just want to get my plan and my agenda, we're making him too small. It is only as you come to him as this woman does in faith, throwing yourself at his feet, telling him everything, that then you can be saved. And notice Jesus' words to her, how he receives her. He says, daughter, your faith has made you well. It is faith in who Jesus is and what he has done that saves. Nothing more and nothing less. Notice he doesn't say, have more faith and then you will be saved. He says, your faith has saved you. Just consider the faith that we know about her. She's afraid. She's uncertain. She doesn't want to see Jesus. She doesn't want anyone else to see her. She's literally snuck in and just grabbed the hem of Jesus' robe, and then she tried to slink away, and Jesus wouldn't let her. That's the faith that she has. That faith is enough to save her. You see, this is not about you conjuring up more faith in order to be saved. This is about you having faith in the person of Jesus. The purpose and point of faith is the object of your faith, not how much faith you have. Weak faith in a strong branch is enough. But strong faith in a weak branch will fail you. And so the purpose of your faith, the direction of your faith, the power of your faith is in who you place your faith in, not in you. And so when you place your faith in Jesus, that is faith enough. Which means you don't have to have everything figured out this morning. You don't have to have all your questions answered, your doubts resolved, your struggles figured out. All you have to have is faith that God has come to you in Jesus and that he is taking care of everything for you. That is the faith that saves. And so if you come to them this morning weak, faltering, struggling, suffering, unsure, he will receive you and he will save you. That is what it means that our salvation is by grace through faith. And it's his grace towards us as we place his faith in him that makes us whole. So let's talk for a few minutes about how you can begin to experience that in your life. Now, how do you actually begin to experience this healing that is salvation in your life? I think we can see in this story at least 3 ways in which salvation begins to heal us. The first is this, is that salvation heals our isolation. Salvation heals our isolation. This woman's condition has left her isolated and alone. She's exhausted herself on doctors and appointments and tests, and yet none of it has fixed the problem. Now, what we can't immediately understand from the text, but we would if we understood the larger context, is her suffering was not just physical, it was also social. The fact that she had this 12-year flow of blood meant that for 12 years she was ceremonially unclean, which in ancient Jewish context meant that you couldn't go to the synagogue, you couldn't go to the temple, you couldn't offer sacrifices, you couldn't even touch anyone, otherwise you would transfer your uncleanliness. Even the clothes that you wore and the chair that you sat on would be considered unclean. And so for 12 years, she has suffered not just physically, but also socially. Her sickness has isolated her. Now, this is where all of us are before Jesus finds us. Isolated and alone. Lost in our sin and lost in our suffering. Since the very first sin, we have been pointing the finger at other people and hiding in our shame. That's what we still do today. Today we exist in the middle of an epidemic of loneliness that's killing us. Loneliness, chronic loneliness, has the same impact as smoking on your body. And so the very first thing that Jesus says to her, notice, daughter. For 12 years, she has not been embraced. For 12 years, she has had to hide. She's had to avoid people. She hasn't been able to see her loved ones without fear of contaminating them. And yet when she comes to Jesus, the first thing he says to her is, daughter. In other words, come home. Find rest with me. He is calling her out of her isolation and back into relationship with himself and with his people. You see, the gospel reconciles us back to God. We were separated in our sins, but Jesus is the bridge. He is the means by which you and I are reconnected to God and reconnected to each other. And so the healing power of salvation happens primarily in the context of community with other people. Right now, Jesus is at the right hand of God the Father in human flesh, glorified human flesh. So at the right hand of God is someone who looks like you, someone who represents you, someone who stands in your place, and he is also the exalted Son of God, which means he is divinity advocating on your behalf. Right? There's no loneliness here. There is connection here. There is an open ear here between you and the throne room of God, but he's also then brought us into community with each other. He makes us whole through our relationships with others. That's why he calls her forward in the middle of the crowd. Because if she had just received her healing, she could have gone on her way with her healing, but she would still be isolated. She would still be alone. Instead, he calls her daughter, and she steps forward, and she tells him the truth about everything, and then everyone sees that she's healed. Salvation heals us by bringing us out of our isolation and into community with each other. which is why the full experience of salvation can only come in the context of community with other people. You can experience a lot of salvation by yourself, but you will not experience the fullness of salvation by yourself. That's why 1 John 4:12 says this, no one has ever seen God. But if we love one another, God remains in us, and his love is made complete in us. Meaning that if you want to know more of God, you have to know more of people. The second way that salvation heals us is it heals us from our wounds. Mark tells us that the pain of her experience was not just the physical pain associated with her condition, but also suffering at the hands of medical providers. He tells us she has for 12 years seen doctors and says she has endured much. Now, the language of this tells us that she has endured much, yes, physically, but also she's endured much in the process of trying to figure out why this won't stop. Why do I continue to carry this suffering? Why do I continue to carry this condition? Some of you know exactly what that's like. Chronic pain, chronic sickness, unexplained symptoms, and you cannot find an answer. And tests and medical professionals, as intelligent as they are and as much as we know, don't seem to provide solutions. The effects of sin are not just limited to my personal life and my personal relationship with God. They also create ruptures. In my relationships with other people, they create limitations on our ability to understand what's going on. Sin has this permeated effect throughout our world. And so as a result, she carries 12 years of trauma in her body. And that doesn't go away easily. All of us carry wounds that arise from living in a sinful world among sinful, broken people, ourselves included. That's why, as the famous book says, the body keeps the score. We carry those things in us, in our memories, in our recollections, even our bodies as they move throughout the world. Some of our deepest wounds arise from places where we were seeking healing and yet we experienced hurt. People that we thought we could trust who in turn either ignored us or avoided us or abused us in the process. We carry wounds. She went to these doctors thinking that they could help, but it only created more problems and more pain. Psychology tells us that trauma is not just the terrible things that happen to us. It's also, in fact, more so, the way that people respond to us in the midst of that terrible thing. Two people can go through the same exact difficult, terrible experience, and one of them will be traumatized and the other won't. And the primary difference is how people around them receive them in their pain. And so one of the primary ways that we heal from our wounds is by telling our story to a compassionate, empathetic listener. Because what happens is as we unpack the wounding, as we talk about the difficulty and the suffering that we experience, our brains and our bodies get super dysregulated. Our emotions are all over the place as we're reliving that experience. But the attuned empathy of that other person helps regulate us. And so as a result, our traumatic memory begins to settle, begins to change. Now that's 21st century psychology. Notice what Jesus is doing. He invites her back into his presence. She throws himself at her feet, and she tells him everything. What is everything? That's not just like what happened in this moment, but the past 12 years. She tells him everything that she suffered, all the pain, all the unanswered questions. The language is she tells him all of it. And Jesus stands there, unmoved, not running away, not fleeing from her. He stands there and he looks at her and he calls her daughter. He's listening with empathy. He says, your faith has healed you. But notice that's not all he says. He also says, go in peace and be healed. Now she already has been healed. What's happening? He is speaking a different story into her life. He's speaking a different direction into her life from here on out. She's been healed from her body. Now, as she rests in the peace of Jesus' presence and his salvation work in her life, now she has a new trajectory. Now she has a new direction. The wounds that she was carrying, Jesus is now speaking peace into those places, and he wants her to be healed. Some of us, we have salvation in our minds and in our hearts, but not our bodies yet. We haven't told Jesus everything. We haven't opened up about all the things that have happened to you. You haven't shared that with anybody else either. So some of us, to experience the true healing power of salvation might mean that we sit with Jesus and we sit with a trusted advisor or counselor and we tell him everything. And we allow his presence and his spirit, both in us and in that listener, to bring new healing and new peace. He wants wholeness for you. And so many of us carry fractured lives that we haven't yet told him everything about. But he wants to make you whole. Lastly, salvation heals us from our fear. Heals us from our fear. We've talked a lot about the first story, but let's consider the second story as we close. Notice Jesus told the woman, "Go in peace," but he tells the family who just lost their daughter, "Don't be afraid." The healing of salvation saves us from fear. It saves us from the fear of what happens if we die. Right? Like, if we're honest, the real scary thing about diagnosis, the real scary thing about sickness, all the layers beneath wellness and healthcare is that we want to preserve and prolong life because we're afraid of what happens after we die. And it makes sense. It feels final. But because of Jesus and what he accomplished in his death and resurrection, death is not the last enemy. It is not the great unknown. It does not get the last word. Instead, because of what Jesus has accomplished for us, death has been defeated, and as a result, sickness is still there. It still matters. Jesus doesn't say, "Hey, just get over your sickness with a little mental trickery." He says, "No, your bodies are still sick, but let me tell you, I'm going to heal your body and your soul. I'm going to rescue your body and your soul." Because of his victory over death, we know that true healing comes in the kingdom as it comes into our earth at the end of all things. Which means that whatever happens with our sickness, whatever happens in our disease, whatever happens in our struggle, even if it takes us, that's not the end. And so that changes how we fear sickness and death. Yes, it's okay to be afraid. Yes, it's okay to be anxious. Yes, it's okay to feel the uncertainty of that moment, but the ultimate decision on those things has already been decided by Jesus. He has already won the victory. He's already defeated death, and so even when sickness takes us, we don't have to fear the ultimate end. And so that changes how you face your sickness and your suffering right now. Changes the intensity of it. Changes your perspective on it. And we know that even if sickness takes us, there is still true healing waiting for us in the kingdom. And so I can fight my sickness with courage. I can fight it with faith, and it can actually even become a place in which I learn to trust Jesus more in the midst of my struggle. And so he can take even your sickness and your struggle and use it to make you whole. There was a plague that swept the Roman Empire in 165 AD. Lasted for 15 years. People were so freaked out that they began to flee the cities and run to the countries. They would leave family and friend behind. They would go off on their own. It was the first century equivalent of social distancing. They would run. The cities began to be emptied. But there was one group of people who stayed. They were called the Galileans, the Christians. They followed this rabbi from Jerusalem. And as Rome emptied, as the pagans left because they were so afraid of death, the Christians stayed because their rabbi taught them to care for the sick. And their rabbi taught them that death was not the final enemy. And so they stayed and they cared for the loved ones and the family members that had been abandoned, the children that had been abandoned because they were sick. And as a result, Christianity took over the Roman Empire in the next generation. Because as it turns out, the sickness actually just needed attentive care and water and food. And so the Christians would tend to these simple everyday needs, and people would be healed and people would be restored, and people began to think that Christians had this magical power. But then they began to talk about Jesus. And then they began to invite these people who had experienced the compassionate hands of disciples of Jesus, and they began to hear about this rabbi who overcame death, and they believed. And so historians credit that plague with the transformation, the victory of Christianity in that region. Because they didn't fear death as much as they feared their rabbi. What would it look like for that to be true of you? To step into the places of sickness and suffering around you. To walk with your neighbors or your friends or your family members through their trial and their suffering. To even carry your own suffering with a confidence that says, yes, this is hard. Yes, this is difficult, but I will not fear because I follow a rabbi who has overcome death. And so I can carry this suffering with courage, knowing that he will use even this to make me whole. You see, this is what salvation does in us. It heals us, but then it sends us to heal others. Some of you are here this morning and your hang up with Jesus is because he didn't heal you, or he didn't heal a friend or a family member. You're treating Jesus as a means to an end. But he's not a talisman to heal you. He's a person who wants to make you whole. And if you come to him like this woman came to him and throw yourself at his feet and believe in him, he will bring wholeness into your life. But you first have to answer his call. Others of you, you're like the woman or even this family. You're suffering even right now. You're asking, how much longer, Jesus? Would you take this away from me? Why aren't you doing anything here? The answer of this story shows us that Jesus is in the midst of your suffering right now. He's not distant from it. He's not detached from it. He's not afraid of it. He is walking with you through it. And so you can bring your questions to him, your pain to him, your wounds to him, your fear to him, and he will hold you close. And when you do that, he will turn and say to you, as he said to this woman, daughter, son, be at peace. Your faith has healed you. Don't be afraid. May you hear that voice in your own spirit even this morning. Because this is what salvation does. It's not just forgiveness, but it's healing. It's wholeness, both now and forever.